at one point, the Ethiopian government and I guess Eritrea decided that the way to defeat the the TDF was to essentially starve the people of Tigray.
That's absolutely correct. The key weapon, and sadly the most effective weapon they had, was starvation. And this war of starvation unfolded in two phases. The first was when they were actually in occupation of Tigray, which was from about the end of November of 2020 for about 8 months. And that was a period of pillaging and looting, stealing food, destroying businesses, closing the banks, stealing the money, destroying the health infrastructure, the water infrastructure, raping tens, if not hundreds of thousands of women and girls, and so on. So destroying everything that was there to sustain life, to sustain livelihoods and development, driving people off their land, etc. And then when the Tigrayans had drove out the occupiers and controlled Tigray, they were completely surrounded. And what the Ethiopian and Eritrean forces did was they enforced a blockade, which meant almost no humanitarian aid went in. And all banking services, telecommunications, trade, etc., was completely shut off. So all those people who had their life savings in banks, in insurance schemes, and so on, couldn't get hold of any money. No one could be paid. Business ground to a halt, and then virtually no aid was allowed in. And then when the war resumed in August of this year, and the advancing armies of Ethiopia and Eritrea overran quite significant areas of Tigray again, more than 1 million people were displaced, and they simply had absolutely nowhere to go, no shelter, no food, no medicine, and it really looked as though hundreds of thousands would die. In fact, the death toll from famine during the last 2 years is estimated at about 600,000. That's about 1 in 10 Tigrayans perished of hunger and disease during this period. It's a terrible toll.
So where has the UN been during this time? Where has the United States been during this time? I don't know other players. I know that China at one point had invested heavily in Ethiopia. I don't know if that has continued. But where is the rest of the world while this is happening?
Pretty much looking the other way is the answer to that. Normally one would expect the African Union to take a lead in addressing conflicts in Africa. In this case, the African Union headquarters is in the Ethiopian capital, Addis Ababa, and has always been somewhat under the thumb of the Ethiopian government. So right at the beginning, when African leaders began to mobilize, they sent a delegation of 3 former heads of state to Addis Ababa to press for peace. And they were rebuffed, and the African Union actually then said, no, we'll handle this as a domestic matter. We won't invoke our peace and security mechanisms to respond to this. And what should then have happened is the UN Security Council should have taken it up. But the Ethiopians found they had strong allies in China and Russia, and which threatened vetoes, and the Western nations, which were initially very concerned, weren't able to override that. When President Biden took office, he appointed a special envoy, and began in his first months in office making some very strong statements, saying that the level of ethnic cleansing, of mass rape, of starvation was completely unacceptable. But he got very little diplomatic traction. And there wasn't much popular outrage, partly because the very, very little press coverage. And so, the conscience of ordinary people has not really been stirred around this. And after a while, the U.S. policy has been very much, let's stick with the devil we know, that is Abiy Ahmed, rather than trying to engineer some form of power sharing or changing government. They just didn't want to go down that road. And so the U.S. has been pretty weak in and pretty slow in pushing for peace negotiations and for humanitarian access to save the starving.
Well, I mean, we have been asked to cover this for months and months, and to some extent, we don't have the resources to be doing on the ground reporting, and no one here has a particular expertise in that area, and it has really taken a long time for us to get just even a handle on who we should bring on to talk about it, because we have no sort of mechanism to even assess what people coming on, and it does feel like there is a tremendous amount of information warfare, if you will, for lack of a better term, coming out of this conflict to obscure the basis of the conflict and what's actually happening on the ground. There feels like there has been a failure across multiple, I guess, mechanisms, including the UN and including journalism, in addressing this. With 600,000 people die, and in a matter of what effectively is months. Give me your sense of that.
I think that's absolutely correct. I mean, it's remarkable that the last international journalist who was able to travel into Tigray was Declan Walsh of the New York Times, who went in June of last year. So that is 18 months ago. There hasn't been a single international journalist permitted in since then. And that information blockade, blackout seems, unfortunately, to work. It means that there is very little reporting, and we would expect that humanitarian workers of whom a certain number, a small number, were allowed in, would not, in normal circumstances, would also be reporting. They'd be gathering data, but they've not been allowed to speak out. Basically any aid worker who comes out of Tigray and comes out with pictures or with data is told, if you make these available, your organization will be expelled from the country. And 14 months ago, the Ethiopians expelled a number of very senior UN aid workers for precisely this reason, and they got the others to shut up very effectively. And you add on to this a very aggressive social media campaign, so that people like me who've spoken out about it, we are deluged with really hateful social media messages and campaigns, with my university being deluged with demands that I be fired and so on. And most of the people who would normally be writing columns about this and so on, it's you have to have a very thick skin to continue writing when you know you will be relentlessly attacked and defamed in this way. But one thing that we're just beginning to see now, because the conflict isn't just in Tigray, it's in other parts of Ethiopia too. And the same people who purvey these very hateful, violence-inciting social media messages have got such a sense of impunity that they're losing a sense of proportion and restraint. So that over the last week, from the south of the country, from the Oroma area where the conflict is also ongoing, they've been circulating videos of the militiamen parading around villages with severed heads on sticks, and videos of people being burned alive or even skinned alive, the sort of medieval barbarism that you wouldn't expect to see in the 21st century. And I think that is beginning to wake up a wider constituency to just how horrible this war is and how gross the atrocities that are being perpetrated are.
What's your sense of where this disinformation campaign, or I mean, we know the source of the media blackout, right? It's a crackdown. But in terms of who might be organizing it online to suppress it from getting to a international audience, can you speculate on that?
Oh, it doesn't. You don't need to speculate. It's very clear that there are certain diaspora Ethiopian groups that are organizing this, and they are encouraged and on occasions organized and financed by the Ethiopian government, by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. About a year ago, he actually dismissed most of his ambassadors because he said they weren't doing a good enough job. And he said, well, our Twitter lions are doing a far better job, and these are the people who should be given the resources for advocating on our behalf.